On a crisp autumn morning in September 1945, a convoy of olive-drab trucks rumbled through the mountain passes of northwestern Wyoming, carrying 73 Japanese prisoners of war from the Heart Mountain internment camp. The men sat in rigid silence, their eyes fixed on the towering peaks of the Absaroka Range, convinced they were being transported to some remote location for execution. After all, in their military training, they had been taught that capture meant dishonor worse than death, and surely the Americans would show no mercy to enemies who had fought so fiercely across the Pacific Islands. They could not have been more mistaken about what awaited them. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these men were about to witness would shatter every assumption they held about their captors and challenge their understanding of the natural world itself, transforming bitter enemies into bewildered witnesses to one of Earth's most extraordinary geological wonders. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto sat near the tailgate of the lead truck, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. At 32 years old, he had commanded an infantry company on Saipan before being captured during the final days of fighting in July 1944. The shame of survival still burned in his chest like acid. Beside him, Corporal Hiroshi Nakamura, barely 21, stared at his worn boots, convinced that every kilometer brought them closer to their end. The younger man had whispered prayers to his ancestors throughout the previous sleepless night at the camp. Technical Sergeant James McKinley of the United States Army rode in the passenger seat of the first truck, reviewing his orders with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. The directive from the War Department's Prisoner of War Operations Division had been clear but unusual. Transport selected Japanese POWs to Yellowstone National Park for a recreational visit as part of the Geneva Convention Compliance Program. McKinley, a veteran of the Aleutian Islands campaign, had harbored deep resentment toward Japanese forces since losing his brother at Guadalcanal. The idea of giving these men a sightseeing tour seemed absurd, perhaps even offensive. Yet orders were orders, and he would carry them out with professional detachment. The convoy passed through the Roosevelt Arch at the park's north entrance just after 10 o'clock in the morning. The inscription overhead read, "For the benefit and enjoyment of the people," words that seemed to mock the prisoners who had been taught that Americans were cruel barbarians who would torture and execute them without hesitation. Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, a Chinese-American interpreter from San Francisco, turned in his seat to address the men in fluent Japanese. "Your commanders told you lies," he said simply. "Today, you will see something your military leaders never wanted you to know about this country." The prisoners exchanged uncertain glances but remained silent. They had been conditioned to expect tricks and psychological warfare. As the trucks climbed toward Mammoth Hot Springs, the landscape began to reveal its peculiarities. Steam rose from dozens of terraces cascading down the hillside, creating an otherworldly scene of white and orange mineral deposits that seemed to glow in the morning sun. Yamamoto leaned forward, his trained military mind struggling to categorize what he was observing. Artillery smoke? Some kind of industrial facility? But there were no factories, no signs of human construction beyond the simple wooden walkways that wound between the formations. The convoy stopped at the lower terraces, and McKinley ordered the prisoners to dismount. They filed out slowly, maintaining the discipline that had been drilled into them since basic training, forming neat ranks on the gravel parking area. Several armed guards took positions around the perimeter, but their weapons remained slung over their shoulders in a casual manner that surprised the prisoners. In the Japanese military, guards always held their weapons at ready, especially around captives. Sergeant Chen gestured toward the terraces. "You are free to walk and observe," he announced. "Stay within sight of the guards. Do not wander off the designated paths. And yes, you may take photographs if you have cameras." This last statement caused visible confusion among the prisoners. Photographs they were being encouraged to document. What exactly? A trap? Some elaborate form of humiliation? Corporal Nakamura was the first to approach the formations, drawn by the hypnotic cascade of water flowing over the bright white travertine. He knelt beside a small pool, extending his hand tentatively toward the water before jerking it back in shock. "It's hot," he exclaimed. The water is actually hot. Yamamoto joined him, touching the stone formations with careful fingers. The mineral deposits were warm, almost alive beneath his touch. Hundreds of springs fed the terraces, creating an endless flow of steaming water that deposited layer upon layer of calcium carbonate in shades of cream, orange, rust, and gold. The lieutenant had studied geology as part of his university education before the conflict, but he had never encountered anything like this in Japan's volcanic regions. Private First Class Helen Morrison, a geology student from Montana who had joined the Women's Army Corps and been assigned to educational duties at the POW camp, approached the group with genuine enthusiasm. She had volunteered for this assignment specifically because she believed in the power of natural wonders to transcend human conflict. "What you're seeing is the result of water traveling deep underground," she explained through Sergeant Chen's translation. "It heats up as it descends, sometimes reaching temperatures over 170 degrees Fahrenheit. Then it rises back to the surface, carrying dissolved minerals that create these formations. Mammoth has been building these terraces for thousands of years." Nakamura looked at her with undisguised skepticism. "Thousands of years?" he asked quietly. "How is that possible?" Morrison smiled patiently. "The earth beneath Yellowstone is special. This entire region sits above a hotspot in the planet's mantle, a massive chamber of molten rock that fuels all the thermal features you'll see today." Over the next hour, the prisoners explored the terraces with increasing fascination. Several who had been engineers and scientists before the conflict began examining the formations with professional interest, sketching diagrams and taking notes in small journals they had been permitted to carry. The guards maintained their relaxed posture, occasionally sharing cigarettes and coffee among themselves, behavior that seemed incomprehensibly casual to men trained in the rigid hierarchy of the Imperial Japanese Army. Private Kenji Watanabe, a former high school teacher from Osaka, approached McKinley with hesitant steps. Through Sergeant Chen, he asked permission to speak. The technical sergeant nodded curtly. "Why are you showing us this?" Watanabe asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We are your enemies. We fought against you. Why bring us to this beautiful place?" McKinley was silent for a long moment, his jaw working as he considered the question. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, as if he were discovering his own answer in the process of voicing it. "Because the conflict will end," he said. "It already has ended, really, though you men were captured before the final surrender. And when it's over, you'll return to Japan. The War Department believes that men who have seen what America truly is, not what your propaganda told you we were, might help build a better peace." "That's the theory anyway," Chen translated faithfully, though he added his own observation. "I was born in this country," the sergeant said. "My parents came from Guangdong province. I grew up believing that America's strength came from its weapons and factories. Only later did I understand that the real power comes from things like this, natural wonders that belong to all people, protected by law so that future generations can experience them. No emperor owns Yellowstone. No corporation can buy it. It exists for everyone." The words hung in the air as the prisoners absorbed their implications. In their homeland, virtually every resource had been mobilized for the war effort. The concept of preserving land purely for its natural beauty, making it freely accessible to ordinary citizens, seemed almost incomprehensible to men who had grown up under an increasingly militarized regime. The convoy continued south through the park, following the winding roads through Hayden Valley. Herds of bison grazed in the grasslands, massive animals that seemed indifferent to the human observers. Several prisoners, who had only seen cows in Japan, stared in amazement at these creatures, some weighing nearly a ton, moving with surprising grace across the landscape. But nothing could have prepared them for Old Faithful. The trucks parked in the large lot near the famous geyser just before 2 o'clock in the afternoon. A crowd of civilian visitors, families with children, elderly couples, young soldiers on leave, had already gathered around the viewing area. The sight of so many ordinary Americans going about peaceful recreation while their nation was technically still at war created a strange cognitive dissonance for the prisoners. Morrison checked her watch and announced that an eruption was predicted within the next 20 minutes. "Old Faithful erupts approximately every 91 minutes, she explained. "It's one of the most predictable geysers in the world. Each eruption lasts between 2 and 5 minutes and sends water up to 180 feet in the air. Yamamoto translated quietly for those prisoners whose English was limited. Several men laughed nervously, assuming this was some kind of joke or exaggeration. Water shooting nearly 200 feet into the sky every 90 minutes. Impossible. Perhaps the Americans were testing their gullibility, setting up some elaborate prank. As they waited, a young American boy, perhaps 8 years old, approached the group with the fearless curiosity of childhood. He stared openly at the Japanese prisoners in their distinctive uniforms, then tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mommy, why are those soldiers dressed differently?" he asked in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. The woman paled, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. She started to pull her son away, but McKinley surprised everyone by kneeling down to the boy's level. "These men are from Japan," he said gently. "They're visiting Yellowstone just like you are." "Are they the bad guys?" the boy asked with the blunt honesty of children. McKinley paused, then shook his head slowly. "They were on the other side of the conflict," he said, "but that doesn't make them bad guys. They're just people, like everyone else." The mother hurried her son away, but the exchange had been witnessed by many in the crowd and by all the prisoners. Nakamura felt unexpected tears prick his eyes. The casual humanity of the interaction, the American sergeant's refusal to demonize his enemies in front of a child, stood in stark contrast to everything he had been taught about the barbaric Americans who supposedly tortured prisoners and showed no mercy. Then the ground began to tremble. It started as a low rumble, felt more than heard, causing several prisoners to instinctively crouch into defensive positions. Yamamoto's military training kicked in, and he scanned the horizon for aircraft or artillery, but the sky was clear and empty. The rumbling intensified, and suddenly the geyser's pool began to surge. What happened next would be seared into the memories of every man present for the rest of their lives. Old Faithful erupted with tremendous force, sending a column of superheated water and steam rocketing into the brilliant blue Wyoming sky. The roar was deafening, a primal sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. The column climbed higher and higher, 100 feet, 150, reaching toward 180 feet at its peak, creating a massive plume of white steam that caught the afternoon sunlight and created a rainbow in its mist. The Japanese prisoners stood frozen in stunned silence. Several dropped to their knees involuntarily, overwhelmed by the raw power and beauty of the spectacle. Corporal Nakamura openly wept, his hands covering his face as his shoulders shook. Private Watanabe gripped Yamamoto's arm so tightly it would leave bruises. "It's impossible," Yamamoto whispered in Japanese, his voice hoarse with emotion. "It cannot be real." But it was real, and it continued for 4 minutes and 17 seconds, measured carefully by Morrison's stopwatch. Thousands of gallons of water, heated by the massive magma chamber miles below, expelled with enough force to be heard across the valley. When the eruption finally subsided, leaving only wisps of steam rising from the depleted pool, the prisoners remained motionless, as if waking from a profound dream. Sergeant Chen understood the significance of this moment. In Japan, natural phenomena were often viewed as manifestations of divine power or ancestral spirits. These men were witnessing something their worldview struggled to categorize, a regular, predictable, scientifically explainable event that nonetheless carried an almost spiritual weight. "This happens every 90 minutes, Chen repeated quietly in Japanese. "It has happened for generations. It will continue happening for generations more. No human power created it. No empire controls it. It simply is." The remainder of the afternoon passed in a daze for many of the prisoners. The convoy stopped at several more thermal features, the vivid colors of Grand Prismatic Spring, the bubbling mud pots at Fountain Paint Pot, the thundering cascade of Lower Falls. At each location, Morrison provided scientific explanations, while the prisoners struggled to process the sheer abundance of natural wonders concentrated in this single preserve. What struck many of them most profoundly was not just the geological features themselves, but the American approach to them. The park was free to enter for all visitors. The walkways and viewing areas were carefully designed to protect the formations while allowing close observation. Rangers patrolled not to restrict access, but to educate visitors and prevent damage to the fragile thermal features. The entire system seemed designed around preservation and public access rather than exploitation or military utility. During the return journey to Hart Mountain, as the sun set behind the Teton Range in a blaze of orange and purple, the trucks were no longer filled with tense silence, but with animated conversation. Prisoners who had barely spoken to each other in months of captivity now debated geology, compared observations, and struggled to articulate what they had witnessed. Yamamoto sat quietly, his mind working through the implications of the day. He had been an officer in an army that had taught him Americans were soft, decadent, and spiritually weak, a nation of materialists without the warrior spirit that supposedly defined Japanese superiority. Yet today he had seen something that challenged that entire framework. A nation that could preserve such wonders, that could set aside vast territories, not for military bases or industrial development, but simply for the enjoyment and education of its people, was not weak. It was confident in a way that transcended military might. It possessed a kind of cultural strength that his militaristic education had never acknowledged. The strength to value something beyond immediate utility, to think in terms of generations rather than campaigns. In the days and weeks that followed, the Yellowstone trip became legendary among the prisoners at Hart Mountain. Those who had gone returned changed, speaking with an almost evangelical fervor about what they had seen. The camp administrators, pleased with the results, began organizing additional trips for other prisoner groups. But the impact extended far beyond morale improvement. When these men eventually returned to Japan after the conflict's end, many became educators, diplomats, and businessmen who maintained a connection to America that went deeper than political alliance. They had seen something that propaganda could never erase, a glimpse of a society that valued natural beauty enough to protect it for all people, enemy and friend alike. Corporal Nakamura would eventually become a geology professor at Tohoku University, dedicating his career to studying volcanic phenomena. He kept a photograph of Old Faithful on his office wall for 40 years, and when he finally had the opportunity to return to Yellowstone in 1983, he brought his grandchildren and wept again at the sight of that familiar geyser erupting precisely on schedule. Private Watanabe became a teacher once more, specializing in American literature and history. He wrote extensively about his experience as a prisoner of war, always emphasizing the moment when the American sergeant refused to call Japanese soldiers the bad guys in front of a child. That small act of humanity, he wrote, taught him more about democracy than 1,000 political speeches. Lieutenant Yamamoto returned to Japan with a fundamentally altered worldview. He abandoned his military career and instead joined the nascent effort to rebuild Japanese democratic institutions. In his memoirs, published in 1972, he devoted an entire chapter to the Yellowstone trip, describing it as the moment when I understood that true strength lies not in the power to destroy, but in the wisdom to preserve. The program itself continued throughout the remainder of 1945 and into 1946, with over 400 Japanese and German prisoners of war visiting Yellowstone as part of the cultural re-education efforts. Not all were transformed as dramatically as Yamamoto and his group, but camp records show that prisoners who participated in the trips demonstrated significantly lower rates of resistance, higher cooperation with authorities, and more positive attitudes toward repatriation. What the War Department understood, perhaps better than the prisoners themselves initially did, was that showing these men the reality of American values, the actual lived experience of a democratic society that protected natural wonders for all people, was more powerful than any amount of political propaganda. You cannot convince someone that a nation is culturally bankrupt when they have stood beside Old Faithful and watched the earth itself perform its timeless dance. The story of Japanese prisoners at Yellowstone also reveals something profound about the American approach to the conflict. Even in the midst of a brutal war that had cost hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides, there remained space for this kind of gesture. Impractical from a purely military standpoint, perhaps even controversial, given the depth of animosity many Americans felt toward Japan, yet consistent with the democratic values the nation claimed to represent. The Geneva Convention required adequate treatment of prisoners, but it did not mandate tours of national parks. The decision to implement such programs reflected a broader strategy of winning not just the military conflict, but the subsequent peace. The planners understood that today's prisoners would be tomorrow's citizens of either allied or occupied nations, and their experiences in captivity would shape their attitudes toward America for decades to come. There is a certain irony in the fact that some of the men who most bitterly opposed American forces, who had been willing to die rather than surrender, who had absorbed years of propaganda about American cruelty and weakness, found their worldviews most profoundly challenged, not by interrogation or imprisonment, but by geysers and hot springs. The Earth itself, indifferent to human conflict, became an ambassador for peace. The thermal features of Yellowstone, after all, preceded human civilization by hundreds of thousands of years. Old Faithful was erupting when mammoths walked the plains, and it will likely continue erupting long after our current nations have passed into history. Standing before such timeless natural phenomena has a way of putting human conflicts into perspective, of reminding us that we are temporary stewards of an ancient world. For the Japanese prisoners who witnessed these wonders in the autumn of 1945, this perspective was life-changing. They had been soldiers in a war that had demanded everything from them: their youth, their values, their willingness to die for emperor and nation. They had been captured expecting torture and execution, prepared for the worst their imaginations could conjure. Instead, they saw rainbows in geyser mist. They felt ancient stone warmed by the Earth's internal heat. They watched American families enjoying peaceful recreation in the midst of wartime. They experienced, perhaps for the first time, the cognitive dissonance of having to reconcile their indoctrination with direct, undeniable experience. That dissonance, uncomfortable as it was, opened spaces for new understanding. When certainty shatters, wisdom has room to grow. The guards who accompanied these trips were changed as well. Men like Technical Sergeant McKinley, who began the day with deep resentment toward his charges, found it difficult to maintain that hatred when watching the same men react with childlike wonder to natural beauty. It is hard to dehumanize someone whose tears of awe you have witnessed. This mutual transformation, enemy into fellow observer of wonders, captor into informal educator, represents one of the small, largely forgotten victories of the conflict's aftermath. These were not dramatic battlefield reversals or political triumphs, but quiet moments of human connection that laid groundwork for reconciliation. The Yellowstone trips also demonstrated the power of education over punishment, of exposure over isolation. Rather than keeping prisoners confined to camps with minimal contact with American society, these programs deliberately showed them aspects of American life that contradicted their preconceptions. The strategy was rooted in the optimistic belief that people, given accurate information and direct experience, would generally choose connection over hatred. That optimism was not always justified. Some prisoners remained hostile and unreceptive regardless of what they witnessed. But enough were affected, enough had their perspectives shifted, that the program was deemed worthwhile by its administrators and by historians who later studied its impacts. In the larger context of the conflict, the Yellowstone prisoner visits were a tiny footnote, barely mentioned in most historical accounts. Yet for the individuals involved, these experiences resonated across their entire lives, influencing career choices, philosophical outlooks, and attitudes toward international relations. When Old Faithful erupts today, sending its plume of water and steam into the sky before crowds of international tourists, it does so with the same mechanical regularity it displayed in 1945. The geyser is indifferent to the wars that rage and the peace that follows, to the rise and fall of nations, to the personal transformations of individual humans who witness its displays. But those transformations, quiet and personal as they are, matter. They ripple outward in ways that cannot always be measured or predicted. A prisoner who becomes a professor teaches thousands of students. A soldier who chooses empathy over hatred raises children who inherit that choice. A society that protects natural wonders accessible to all creates shared experiences that transcend political division. The men who stood beside Old Faithful that September day in 1945 are nearly all gone now, claimed by the decades that have passed since the conflict's end. But their testimonies remain, preserved in memoirs, oral histories, and archival records. They speak to a particular moment when enemies became witnesses together, when the earth itself offered a kind of testimony about permanence and change. Lieutenant Yamamoto wrote in his memoirs that watching the geyser erupt, he felt for the first time in years a sense of possibility beyond victory or defeat, beyond honor or shame. He felt connected to something larger than the conflict that had consumed his life, to the planet itself, ancient and ongoing, creating beauty with mechanical regularity, regardless of human drama. That feeling, he wrote, was the beginning of wisdom, the first step toward understanding that the world was larger and stranger, and more wonderful than military training had allowed him to imagine. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.